I'm Suzy Shaw, mom of two, now adult boys, and author of the book Mother of Boys Survival Guide. This podcast shares practical insights, expert advice, and real conversations to help moms raise confident, capable boys. You can find more episodes and resources at mothersofboys.life. Now, let's get into today's conversation.
Middle school boys and risky behavior, warning signs, and how to respond. When my boys were in middle school, I was on high alert about what they might get into. At the time, my biggest concerns were smoking, drugs, and alcohol. If I were parenting a teen today, I would expand that list to include things like pornography and sports betting. The middle school years are a time when boys are curious, impulsive, and beginning to push boundaries as they figure out who they are. For parents, the challenge is knowing what's normal curiosity and what might be a warning sign, and how to respond in a way that keeps communication open rather than shutting down. My guest today is Chris Rogers, an educator, a recovery coach who works directly with young people to help them build awareness, accountability, and healthier decision making. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this.
I understand you're a teacher in New York City. Could you tell me a little bit about your experience and how you got into addiction counseling?
Yeah. So I was a music teacher in New York City for the better part of a decade. I went to school for that. I thought that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I really, really did love it. The last position I had was teaching elementary school general music for all students with learning disabilities. Every student had an IEP, and I was learning a lot and accomplishing a lot. I really loved it. But behind the scenes, in my own private life, was struggling with an out of control behavior. And I was struggling, thankfully, not with drugs, not with alcohol, but the thing for me just so happened to be pornography. Cutting to the chase, 2020 happens. And after lots of trial and error and trying to do this thing on my own and still engaging in, behaviors that eventually escalate into riskier things, I needed to stop kidding myself, and I knew that I needed help. I really knew that I needed to do something significant. Otherwise, I would just kind of be white knuckling it for the rest of my days. I eventually found a program online that radically changed my life with a company called Elevator Recovery, and it absolutely transformed me without trying to sound, hyperbolic or anything like that. It truly, truly did. And I became so involved in this particular community that I was offered a job. I was so passionate about it because not only was I able to use my skills in a new way, it was so healing for me. It was
Mhm.
so transformative and really met me where I was at. And when I was offered that job, I took the leap to do this full time because this was what mattered to me, to be able to truly, authentically, and intimately meet a hurting person, meet someone who's confused and likely have tried so many different ways to conquer a compulsive behavior on their own and be able to take them by the hand and say, "Brother, I've been there." You know what I'm saying? But where I'm at now is really kind of blending those two worlds together. And I've created a program of my own, which I'm sure we'll dive into, called Rebooted Teen. And it's essentially the same program that I was introduced to, but modified for a younger audience. So it takes my life experience, both my experience through my certifications as a, porn and sex addiction recovery coach, as a relapse prevention specialist, and really breaking it down for someone who is in their middle school and high school years. I know what it's like to feel like I couldn't speak to anybody or I couldn't ask anybody certain questions while going through the joys of adolescence. But the
Mhm.
program, its intention is to meet a young person where they're at and provide that same sense of community, just to emphasize the fact that they're not alone, they're not crazy, they're not broken, and that there's hope.
So, what would you say the age is typically of your clients?
Yeah. on average, like 13 to 17. So, like I said, like middle school to high school ages.
So today we're going to try to focus a little bit more on the middle school age, um, and and maybe high school, but thinking of it more as the gateway um, issues. What a parent needs to really look out for during these uh, introductory years, and developmentally, for my boys, this was a really tricky period, the whole middle school period. They go from being the top dog in elementary school to bottom of the rung in middle school, and then bottom of the rung again when they go into high school. And it's just an ever-changing adjustment period.
I absolutely vividly remember being in 5th grade and then going into 6th grade, my first year of middle school, and remember telling my mom, "It feels like I'm in 1st grade again." You know, it's like
Right.
bottom of the rung. It's sort of like it feels like you're at the bottom of the totem pole. So I absolutely can empathize with, a young person experiencing that. But as far as what's going on
Right.
in
What
this.
developmentally is happening at this period?
Yeah, so to really kind of break it down in a nerdy, kind of neurological way for a second, and then we'll get more practical. At this stage in, say anywhere between like a 10 to 12-year-old's, brain development, uh, they're really starting to understand the ins and outs of conversation and thinking more logically and becoming more concrete about their opinions, their likes, their dislikes, what they're comfortable with, what they're uncomfortable with. It's a really, really important time as far as their own development goes. But this is where we get the case of schoolers having no filter.
Mhm.
They like what they like and they don't like what they don't like. If something doesn't fit a certain category, then it's weird, then it's wrong, then it's off, right? Now, in this stage, as they're learning more about the world and they're learning more about themselves, the art form of things like nuance and history and empathy, those are still things that are being developed. Those are things that are
Mhm.
still, on average, being learned at that time. So, as awkward as this might feel for a parent or guardian, it's super important to have those types of conversations during those concrete phases before the learning turns into multiple conversations about unlearning, you know?
Mhm. Right. In my book, I call that stage the man cub stage because they become man size and they're staring you suddenly in the eye, but brain wise, still very much a cub
Exactly.
and not fully connected.
Right.
Um, And it's also a period of natural curiosity and testing boundaries, which is, what the parents are on the receiving side of at sometimes. So how can parents tell the difference between just normal curiosity and behaviors that might be moving into risky territory? Are there, red flags?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, as far as things to watch out for, as far as things to kind of like, keep your antenna sort of, on the lookout for, there's a few categories that I like to divvy them up into. Now, how do you know when it's time to have a conversation like this? Like, hey, here's what this is, here's what it isn't. How do you know what it's time? Well, some red flags to look out for. I put them up into like three different categories. There's behavioral, there's technological, and there's social. So for behavioral, right? It's like, do you notice a sudden sense of secrecy around their device usage? Don't look at my phone, don't touch my iPad, Do you find like they're more prone to using maybe over-sexualized language, when they're just like talking with their friends or making jokes? It's just things to look out for. Doesn't automatically mean that all the red flags are there and it's a
Mhm.
problem. It's an opportunity to open up a conversation. Second category is those technological cues. So for example, if you take a look at your child's device, which by the way, let me throw this in there. I'm a big advocate for this. If you are a parent or a guardian, and if your child has a device, odds are you got that device for them. I'm a big advocate for having a not a huge conversation, but make a big point to say, this is mine, but I'm
So
letting,
I said exactly that to
I'm so glad.
my boys. I'm like, "I pay for it.
Yep.
It is mine. It
Perfect.
is mine. I will take a look at it anytime I want to."
Perfect. With that said, if you notice on their device, do they have multiple apps for chatting with others, viewing content, things like that, web browsing? It's just something to be in the know about. There's
Right.
more and more apps that are prone to contain explicit or adult content. While not pornographic in nature, it is very, very likely that certain things will crawl through the cracks. Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube, Discord. It's just things to be aware of. That's all.
Mhm. Right.
And the third being social, right? So when you hear them speak, when they talk to you, do you notice, for example, a sense of cynicism around
Mhm.
things like relationships or marriage, about men, about women, about intimacy? Is there a spark of curiosity perhaps that seems kind of beyond their age? It's just like, where did you hear that from? Right. Again, it's not like, oh, sound the alarm, but all we're looking for are opportunities to open up a dialogue. I know we probably know this logically, but I'll say it anyway. The problem is not your child, right? When we open up these types of conversations, we go at it with the sense of like a combative nature, it's likely to have them shut down. I mean, if I don't
Mhm.
care how old you are, if someone's coming at us like, "Why don't you do this?" Ugh, there's a natural sense to recoil, to self-preserve, to protect yourself, right? If you lead with shame, they're gonna stay the same. But remember, it's not you versus your child, it's both of you together versus the problem. It's versus the unwanted behavior. So,
Mhm.
those are just some things to keep your antenna on the lookout for. But remember, the mission is not to punish, the mission is curiosity. Open up a
Mhm.
dialogue to get to see where they're coming from.
We've had a couple of really powerful podcasts with professionals talking about communication with teens and how not to get into that adversarial relationship, which I I will say some of that is not addressing it at the moment that you discover it, because at that moment, you're in such a heightened level of emotion and alert that you're probably not gonna be able to communicate, effectively and smoothly. The other thing I would say is that the mob, which is the mothers of boys, the friends of mine that we were all sort of in it together. That was really critical in uncovering, behavior because it typically was not done in a vacuum.
Right.
And and some kids talk more than other kids. And so it just a little bit of intel goes a long way too. So when you do, you know, feel like something's going on, to be able to, check with the other moms in your friend group, I found very helpful.
Yeah, confiding in others. I mean, community is everything. I mean, there's the free resources that I have for parents or guardians online. It's called the Rebooted Teen Parent Program, where I literally walk you through conversation starters, like things to keep in mind when approaching these types of conversations. And there's a Facebook group where we can confide in one another, trade notes, see what others are having success with or struggling with. It really, really comes in handy. Like there's wisdom in community. It's
Oh,
like there's
100%.
the as it's commonly said, iron sharpening iron, like really keeping yourself sharp, but the more personal something feels, the more universal it actually is. So whether it's the mob or whether it's the Reboot Teen Parent Program
Right.
community group, we've got your back. The more personal something feels, the more universal it is.
So, there's a lot of um, different flavors. I would say of addiction concern. There's You mentioned pornography, gaming, smoking, vaping, alcohol.
Right.
You know, how does peer pressure begin to show up during, this middle school period and push kids into something?
Sure. Well, I mean, kind of going back to their stage of development, as far as literally at this point in their lives, the way their brain is growing, all the ways that they're developing into more, logically thinking, concrete individuals, they are surrounded by human beings that are going the same metamorphosis themselves. You know what I'm saying? So no wonder it's such an overwhelming time. We all remember middle school, right?
Yeah, the caterpillars becoming butterflies.
Exactly, exactly. So keep that in mind,
Mhm.
surrounded by everybody changing. People are popping out of cocoons. They are blossoming. They are changing physically. They're changing mentally. Peer pressure plays a role in this age because when it comes to, for example, the case of pornography, they're developing a relationship with something that they don't have a full grasp or understanding of yet. There certainly is a pressure to, especially in this day and age, in the age of AI and fake news and social media, where everyone has a platform. You're kind of born into a world where the internet is a stage and you're expected to be a performer. So nobody wants to see a bad performer, So there's this pressure to kind of be on all the time. Oh, I know what that is. Oh, I know the answers. Like I've got it all put together. This is where social media booms. This is the social media creators, the tech geniuses behind it are very, very aware of this sensation and this very volatile period in a young person's life. It gives them that stage to perform on, you know?
So when you are working with a young person, do you encourage them to cut off social media?
At first, I do. Because one skill, one value that I truly, truly encourage a young person to dive into is that sense of self awareness. Who are you without the screen? Who are you without the stage? Now, that might sound overly simplistic, but we got to keep in mind when you get to that sense of confidence, not ego or self importance, when you learn that kind of practice earlier on in your life, it's more likely to stick later on into adulthood. Because again, the problem itself is not the screen. The problem itself is not necessarily the social media. It's the belief behind it and around it. It's that connection to it to the point where it becomes emotionally compulsive. And of course, when you add a sexual element to it in the course of pornography, it kind of takes that from level 1 to level 100. But who are you? What's really important to you? I can't tell someone what should be important to them. I can't tell someone how they should lead their lives. My role as a coach is to provide you with the facilitation for your own self discovery. What is it that you want? Who is it that you want to be? And what is it going to take for you to get there? We develop that enough and make that more of a normalcy early on in life so that when they say turn 18, maybe go off to college and they're on screens maybe without a filter on them and they're sort of free range, do they have that internal muscle memory to think before they speak, to, think before they act? It's not a matter of, oh, we're going to be perfect all the time, but having that foundation to fall back on. That's why it's so important to understand where they're at. But again, understand the value of these types of conversations earlier as opposed to later.
So let's say a middle school mom stumbles across something. Um, what do you think the steps should be, and how do you advise that you begin the conversation?
A couple things come to mind, not the least of which is before you even engage in the conversation, establish your expectations, establish your intentions. What is, as a mother, right? What is your goal of this conversation? What is it that you want to have happen? Is it the intention to teach? Is the intention to lecture? Like, this is what this is? Is it the intention to ask questions, to get curious? There's no wrong answer, but going in with no expectations or no intentions is certainly not going to help you. So go in with a plan. That's the first thing. But the one of the biggest things is establish atmosphere of non-judgment. Again, it goes back to that simple yet profound picture. It's not me versus you, it's us together versus the behavior at hand. That is the mission. It's not a matter of like, I thought I taught you better than this. How could you watch this filth? What's going on internally that would lead you to something like this externally? That is the target. So, non judgment, explaining that it's normal to feel feelings of arousal. Again, during the stage of development, that's what happens. And the more that we sweep these kinds of things under the rug, the more we pretend they don't exist, the more the stigma will persist, right? So, there's a culture of curiosity that I highly encourage the facilitation of, like asking questions like, what leads you there? What is it that you get out of it? You know, as far as what to include in these types of conversations, again, before you engage in the conversation, remember what porn is. Remember what it is. It is fantasy. It is entertainment. It is not real. But also understand someone who hasn't been exposed to a real sexual experience, ideally, someone who does not understand the concept of consent, right? These are things that you can, again, see this as an opportunity to discuss. There's the three C's there's context, conversation, and consent, you know? Just, consent meaning like, the parties involved, they give permission for what's going to happen, right? Things don't just happen haphazardly. There's a relationship there. There's conversation. There's things that happen before, an act occurs. Context, and that sex has a time and a place, right? And conversation, again, we have parts of our body that have names. We don't need to be cutesy. We don't necessarily need to, go down, the stork, the birds and the bees. It's just like, this is what's going on, right? I've seen this part of the movie before, it's like, this is what to expect. So what does it take to achieve that type of real confidence, that pure human confidence that's not dependent on another person's approval, that's not dependent on something or somebody else? It's three things: education, emotional intelligence, and a sense of groundedness. Education in the sense of, oh, okay, like I know about this. I know what this is. So there's less to worry about. I know what this is. It's less mystique and mystery, Emotional intelligence. Again, I know who I am. I know what's important to me. And if I'm feeling uncomfortable, I know who I can turn to for help.
So, do you think there's much of an addiction difference between pornography and alcohol, um, drugs, smoking, all
Mhm.
those dopamine laden things, or do you attack it all in the same way?
The heart of every vice is very similar, not exactly the same, but similar. Simply in the sense of there's something internal that needs medicating. And I found this external substance or behavior to do just that. Whether it's alcohol, whether it's a certain substance, whether it's pornography, whether it's food, whether it's something else. There's something external that's treating to something internal. But the way a behavioral addiction differs from a substance-based addiction is we've developed an unhealthy relationship with something that the body is naturally able to do. For all intents and purposes, I don't need alcohol to live and sustain a life, right? But when it comes to the prolonging of the human species, I'm going to naturally have sexual feelings. So as a teenager. What we're relearning how to do if our behavior in that avenue has become compulsive is to reestablish a healthy connection and relationship with that very real part of us. Now, as far as how it affects the brain, we're talking about, dopamine, the feel good chemical, of course. It's the chemical that's behind our sense of motivation. Because if dopamine weren't involved, then perhaps we wouldn't be addicted to anything, right? That's the thing that kinda keeps us motivated. That kinda it's like that feel-good hormone. But there's also, like, what's called norepinephrine. So, long story short, it is responsible for classifying this particular behavior as important. It's responsible for what's called euphoric recall. So, literally, it's the memory of the high. It's the apex of that particular experience without thinking about the adverse consequences. It's kinda like that part within us that has that tendency to wanna play with fire, you know? There's an adrenal response, Adrenaline is involved, there is, something called prolactin that we become addicted to. So after one orgasms, there is a surge of a chemical that's released called prolactin, and it's that sense of like, "Oh, okay, the job has been accomplished. We can relax now."
As a mom, as a parent, risk management was always a big concern. And, during middle school and high school, part of my risk management strategy was control over the Wi-Fi and the internet. So it was on
Mm.
a schedule, it turned off, it turned back on. So it wasn't on all the time. And a similar strategy with data and the cell phone. I kept a pretty good eye on data and the cell phone. One of the things I wish I had done was purchase, a small safe or some sort of lockbox to
Mhm.
put prescription medication and medication in. And, I just I didn't think about it. I feel like you think about it more when they're little kids and they're toddlers, and then they get into this middle school, high school, and I just didn't think about it as much. And we did have a moment when I discovered one of the boys was trying painkillers that we had in the house, and that was terrifying for me. And we had a very serious, conversation about that. And I also talked to my friends about that. One of my friends told me that she hides all of her medication in her in a tampon box. And isn't that genius?
Genius.
And, um, and she has 3 boys. She's like, "Nobody's gonna go in there and look
Hilarious.
for anything." But, you know, what what sort of tips do you have for this risk management, um, besides what I've just mentioned?
I think I might steal that idea. Oh, man. Well, and speaking of the lockbox, I mean, I think that's certainly a good place to start. Again, this is a tool, not a toy. So after you're done using the hammer, you put it back in the toolbox, right? There's a time and place for it. Now, in the Rebooted Teen Parent Program, we speak a lot about filters. There's a few that I can certainly recommend. Um, but here's the deal. I mean, when it comes to those filters, the best filter that a child, or really anybody, is ever going to have is going to be themselves, which is why it's the harder but long term, more effective avenue to go down when it comes to giving your child the tools and the system to become more of a self advocate. When we're talking about what is it that you actually want? What's going to bring you closer there and what's going to cause you to drift further away? You know? Have the filters on the devices as a place to start? Absolutely. There's tons of accountability based apps that I would love to recommend as far as, navigating screen time, cutting apps off after a certain limit. There's one that I use on my phone just so I'm not scrolling too long called Stay Free. Really practical. It's free. There's another one called Covenant Eyes, which is one that my clients use. It's one you have an ally or a buddy, an accountability partner to kind of monitor your screen time, and if something kind of slips through the cracks, they'll contact that person and say, "What's going on?" You know? There's plenty, but again, the skill that we're trying to develop, especially through this program, is that sense of self-dependability over time. While there's much to learn, while there is so much of the world to discover, in the world of influencers nowadays, you are their original influencer. So walk in that confidence, and I don't say that to be corny, but walk in that confidence, It's start with the training wheels, we can talk about filters, we can talk about the lockbox, great places to start, but know that long term, the goal is to get them to a place where they have, as I mentioned earlier, that foundation to walk on. What's that foundation? That sense of standards, that sense of value, that sense of self-awareness. If we want to raise young people that exhibit a sense of self-control, we need to first conquer the mountain of self-awareness. It starts there. You can't have one without the other.
And I think moms are very powerful in that conversation, with their sons and discussing their expectations of what they expect, across the board. But especially in relationships with women, pornography, and the effects of alcohol and drugs and what that does to the decision making, which totally blunts their good decision making. We have recorded a couple of podcasts that I want to suggest our listeners check into with communications with team. We have Casey O'Rourke, who is a positive discipline trainer. She did a fabulous podcast, and another psychologist, Dr. Gloria Vanderhorst. And so I encourage, moms to listen to those just for how to talk, learn those sentences like what you had said, that how do you have those conversations? Like, help me understand was was one I used a lot,
Mhm.
fill in the blank. What is something you would encourage moms to remember when parenting starts to feel especially hard?
When it comes to conversations like these, it can feel a little intimidating. I mean, here I am using words like norepinephrine. Here's the deal. For any mom that's feeling overwhelmed for, a child in their middle school years, as I said earlier, you are absolutely not alone. There are communities that have your back and have your best interests at heart that are going to meet you where you're at. And if you feel you need that extra facilitation, will help meet your child where he or she is at. You know, that's my heart. And that's why I'm here. And the reason why I'm so passionate about this is because I've seen it from both sides, both as a 13, 14-year-old who, felt all of these feelings and didn't have the verbiage to express them articulately yet, you know? And I've also been in a facilitator, a teacher, a coach's perspective where I get to work with young people that are learning about the world for the first time, that are learning about themselves for the first time, that are watching their friends that they've known for years change in front of their eyes. That caterpillar to butterfly type of thing. Sometimes it's beautiful. Wow, we're growing together. Look at us. And sometimes it can be heartbreaking. My friends aren't my friends anymore. So if what you're looking for is that sense of community, that sense of reinforcement, that's what the Rebooted Teen Parent Program is all about. It's free. It's from my heart to yours for anybody who might be curious or struggling or at the very least curious. You can check it out at rebootedteen.com.
I appreciate you mentioning, the Rebooted Teen Program. It's a valuable resource. There's resources available for for moms and totally agree. It's a community. You're not in this alone. So thank you for that. And we will link to your contact information and the program on the mothersofboys.life website
Sweet.
for this program. And so, Chris, at the end of each episode, I ask our guests to share a motto or a guiding phrase or a thought that a mom can say to herself as she's going through this difficult, period, what do you recommend?
There's a word that means the world to me, and that word is exhale. And the reason why that word means a lot to me is for many reasons, but not the least of which is this. When I was struggling, when I was in a funk, when I was experiencing normal, regular, almost like internally scheduled panic attacks and really struggling with an out of control behavior and feeling alone and feeling stressed out, that pressure to be on all the time. I got on a phone conversation with my aunt, who was like my second mom. And I'm like venting to her. I'm like, Aunt Ellen, I'm freaking out. Everything's crumbling. I'm free. Da, da, da." And she is like really giving it to me on the phone. She just said, Chris, you need to exhale right now and just let it all out. The reason why the other mantra, the more personal something is, the more universal it is, means so much to me also is because I've seen that both in my work, but in my life. And it's a blessing to be able to provide that sense of community for those who need it. And exhale, you know, let it out. And it's okay.
Right. And it's a part of development, and it's, something we all need to understand and communicate about and get through. And this too will pass, right?
Amen.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here on this podcast and talking about what might be a difficult conversation for some parents, but very, very critical.
If this episode meant something to you, please follow and share the Mothers of Boys Survival Guide podcast on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Sharing helps other moms discover the show. Be kind to yourself, moms.